Secure World Foundation. My name is Daniel Porras. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications here at Secure World, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion, Security and Stability of Space, What You Need to Know. This is going to be a very important seminar because there's a big initiative going on right now at the United Nations around space security, and everyone is going to have every member state is going to have an opportunity to submit their own views and perspectives on some of these very difficult issues. And so we're delighted to have a couple of experts here today to talk with us about why this is important and why all member states need to be paying attention to this particular initiative. So Jan, if you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, it's coming along. Oh, let's see, we're having a couple of issues here. Okay, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we just go ahead and go to a couple of brief introductory remarks on this issue. Why is this important? Why are we here today, and why are we talking? So space is becoming increasingly important for everyone. We start all of our discussions and papers with recognition of that. But this is particularly true of great power competition and military activities in general. Satellites are a cornerstone of a lot of activities that are taking place today. Everything from space capability, from communications to everything from communications to reconnaissance to potentially even targeting for missile strike systems. But increasingly what we're seeing is that the technology behind for space is accessible to everyone. So now not only can we send up rockets and send up satellites, we're also finding ways that we can interfere with or potentially even destroy satellites. So this is a big issue that we don't fully understand the consequences of yet. We talk often about space debris and what could happen if we had widespread space debris everywhere. But we've never really sat down and seen what would happen if there was widespread kinetic conflict in outer space. And so the international community has seen this, they've recognized it, and for many, many years, we've been trying to do something about it. They have been trying to do something about it. And of course, organizations like Secure World Foundation are there to try and support. But there's been a lot of gridlock. And so it's been very heartening to see that there is a new initiative that was put forward by the UK last year at the United Nations and was adopted by the General Assembly. That resolution, entitled Reducing Space Threats Through Responsible Norms of Behavior, has a couple of really interesting points to it. And what it asks is for the Secretary General to get input and data from all UN member states on what are the threats in space, what do you see as being responsible norms of behavior, and what do you see as being possible ways forward? And then to submit this input to the General Assembly, which is going to put together a report, which will then be the basis for a new discussion on possible norms of behavior. Now, this is really exciting because they're not necessarily prescribing any particular solution, but at least there's a recognition that we've got a problem and we need to start talking about it. So we're going to talk about that today. I've been going on long enough. I think we're back up and running. So Jan, can you please go to the next slide? All right, so our speakers today, and I'm really delighted to have some of these because they are some old friends of mine. First and foremost, of course, is Miss Victoria Sampson. She's a director of our Washington office for Secure World Foundation, and she's been doing this topic for quite a long time, so she really knows her stuff here. We've also got Mr. David Bartoletti, who is a Directeur des Affaires Internationales chez Eutelsat, so also a company that has been keeping an eye on space security issues for quite a while, and they're one of the few. We've also got Doug Hendricks, who is the CEO of EXO Analytics. EXO Analytics is a space situational awareness company, so a private company that is monitoring outer space, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about what we can see in space. And my old friend, Ms. Pamela Moraga, she is the first secretary at the Permanent Mission of Chile to the international organizations in Geneva, including the Conference on Disarmament, and she leads up their Disarmament, Global Security, and Humanitarian Affairs unit. So somebody who's been looking at this from the emerging space actor side of the conversation. And so with that, Jan, can we go to the next slide? Just a couple of housekeeping rules. First thing, we've got closed captioning. We're trying to make our events more accessible. So if you'd like to turn on the closed captioning, there is a button down here that says CC, closed caption, and you can just click on that. We also have next Q&A. We're going to be opening up for lots of questions. This is going to be a very free-flowing discussion, so there should be plenty of time to chat. If you want to put in a question, there is a button down there that says Q&A. If you have comments, you can put those in the chat, but for actual questions, I'll be monitoring the Q&A. Remember that this is being recorded, and we are live on YouTube as we speak. So, Imam. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we're done. Okay, with that, I would like to hand it over to Victoria to ask you a first question. Victoria, what's going on? What's happening in outer space, and why do we need to be worried about space security?
Sure, I can sum that up really quickly. Thank you everyone for coming. Really glad to be here and have the opportunity to speak about counter space capabilities. What I'll be talking about is an early view of Secure World's counter space threat assessment. The existence of counter space capabilities are not new, but the circumstances surrounding them are. Today, there are increased incentives for development and potential use for offensive counter space. So Secure World has started an open source counter space threat assessment that is updated annually. The purpose is to provide a public assessment of counter space capabilities being developed by countries based on classified information. This year's report will be jointly released with CSIS's counter space threat assessment April 8th. Information on our website will be there as we get closer to the event. We look at counter space capabilities being developed by the United States, China, Russia, France, India, Iran, Japan, and North Korea across 5 categories: direct descent, co-orbital, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber. We look at the current and near-term future capabilities for each country, along with potential military utility. So the evidence does show significant research and development of a broad range of kinetic, that is to say, destructive, and non-kinetic counter space capabilities in multiple countries. However, only non-kinetic capabilities are actively being used in current military operations. So just really quickly, I don't have time to go through all the countries. I'm happy to answer questions later on. And again, I would direct you to our website for the counter space threat assessment. But really quickly, there's strong evidence that China has sustained an effort to develop a broad range of counter space capabilities. China has conducted multiple tests of technologies for rendezvous and proximity operations in both low Earth and geosynchronous orbit that could lead to a co-orbital ASAT capability. However, the public evidence indicates that they have not conducted an actual destructive co-orbital intercept of a target. And there is no public proof that these RPO technologies are being definitively developed for counter space capabilities. China has at least 1 and possibly many 3 programs underway to develop direct descent ASAT capabilities, either as a dedicated counter space capability or as a mid-course missile defense system that could provide counter space capabilities. China has engaged in multiple progressive tests of these capabilities since 2005, indicating a serious and sustained organizational effort. There is strong evidence that Russia has embarked on a set of programs since 2010 to regain many of its Cold War era counter space capabilities. Russia has been testing technologies for RPO in both low Earth and geosynchronous orbit that could lead to or support a co-orbital ASAT capability. And some of these have links to Cold War era LEO co-orbital ASAT program. The technologies being developed by these programs could also be used for non-aggressive purposes, and most of the on-orbit RPO activities to date match these missions. Russia is almost certainly capable of some limited direct descent operations, but likely not yet on a sufficient scale or sufficient altitude to pose a critical threat to space assets. The United States has conducted multiple tests of technologies for RPO in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous. These tests and demonstrations were conducted for non-offensive missions, such as missile defense, on-orbit inspections, and satellite servicing. And the United States does not have an acknowledged program to develop co-orbital capabilities. However, the US possesses the technological capability to develop that, should it decide to do so. While the US does not have an operational acknowledged direct descent ASAT capability, it does have operational mid-course missile defense interceptors that have been demonstrated an ASAT role. The US could probably possess the ability in the near future should it decide to do so. As well, the US is undergoing a major reorganization of its military space operations as part of a renewed focus of space as a warfighting domain that has culminated in the reestablishment of US Space Command and the establishment of the US Space Force. Right now, the mission of this new organization is a continuation of previous military space missions, although some have advocated for expanding their force to include cislunar activities and space-to-ground weapons. And then I know I'm running close on time, so just really quickly, Daniel's going to give me the hook in a sec. While France has long had a space program as well as military space activities, it was not until recently that France has an explicit focus on offensive and defensive counter space capabilities. And this dates back to July 29, 2019, with the release of the first French space defense strategy. India has over 5 decades of experience in space capabilities. Most of it has been civil in focus. However, there's been increasing interest in military space capabilities, culminating with an anti-satellite test in March of 2019, as well as the stand-up of a defense space agency later on that same year. Iran has a nascent space program that includes building and launching small satellites that have limited capability. However, Iran's military, as of last year, now has the independent ability to launch satellites, separate from the civil space program. And when I talked earlier about non-kinetic efforts, this is what we see, particularly with Iran. Iran has a demonstrated electronic warfare capability to persistently interfere with commercial satellite signals. Japan has also been a long-established space actor, and its space activities historically have been civil in nature. However, in 2008, Japan released a basic space law that allowed for national security-related activities in space. And since then, government officials have begun to speak about counter space capabilities and using military space situational awareness. Japan is currently undergoing a major reorganization of its military space capabilities. While Japan also has a latent anti-satellite capability via its missile defense system, but it's not tested in that capacity. And last, North Korea has no demonstrated capability to mount kinetic attacks on US space assets. Officially, North Korea has never mentioned anti-satellite operations or intent. It does not appear motivated to develop dedicated counter space assets. However, it has demonstrated that it can jam civilians' GPS signals within a limited geographical area. So with that, I'll stop. I know there's a lot more information to get through, and I thank you for your time and looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, and of course, questions and discussions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. And I do note that the counter space report is getting longer. So for those of us who work in the arms control business, that's never a good sign. Doug, if I could ask you to flip your camera on so we can see you. And then I can ask you this question, which is, what can we see? Sir, from a security standpoint, what are you seeing? What are you picking up on? And what's going on? What's happening? Where's the technology more than anything? I think a big question that a lot of folks here today are going to want to know is, what can we see and what can't we see? What are the limitations also of our current technology?
Okay. All right. I'll go straight to some slides here and show you kind of what we can and what we can't see. For those of you who don't know, Exo Analytic is a private commercial space situational awareness company. And let's get my slides going. 100% privately funded. So that means we don't answer to anybody as far as where we point our telescopes or what we do with the data that we collect. We have sites all over the world, which means that for all longitudes of the sky and pretty much most latitudes, we have some coverage. The main thing being that we are collecting in real time, but we do have limitations. So number one, here's a chart showing you the different orbit regimes. And if you look at the hairy ball here, Earth, that's where most of the stuff is. And that's low Earth orbit, that's below 2,000 kilometers. That's primarily where you would use radar to observe, though there are a lot of advances coming in daylight, small or shortwave infrared cameras that are allowing folks to start tracking the LEO satellites as well during the daytime. Where we have a real problem though is the sun pretty much shining down on the land makes it difficult to observe satellites with telescopes. So radars are very effective for that. Halfway to the geosynchronous orbit here is what we call medium Earth orbit, and that's where all the GPS satellites live. And then out here at GEO, where most of the value is, that's where there's billions and billions of dollars of value out there. That's where we focus quite simply because that's where most of our customers are interested in protecting their assets. So that's just a little bit of a primer. This is what it looks like from our perspective. Each one of our telescopes pointed up in the night sky, runs a simulated view of the night sky, and all these named objects are objects that are up there in space, and all these little rectangles are where we have telescopes pointed at the time I took the snapshot. So we have 300, more than 300 telescopes, pretty much looking everywhere all the time that we can. So the data that we collect comes in three forms: astrometry, which is where is the object; photometry, which is how bright is the object; and if you have a radar, it would be roughly how big is the object you bounce the signal off it. And also some folks listen to the satellites, and you can get a sense for the power strength of the emissions of the satellite. So that'll fall under photometry. And then imagery, we take from our distance to geo, satellites just look like a dot. But from just that information, where is it, how bright is it, and looking at the dot, we can tell a lot of stuff. So I'll give you some examples here. All right, so we can tell you if the satellite has changed its attitude, the way it's pointing in space. We can tell you if it has maneuvered. We can track satellites during proximity operations. Victoria kind of, and Dan, you kind of laid the groundwork for that. Current state of the art with what we can do there is when satellites are within a half a kilometer, we cannot track them currently. Between a half a kilometer and a kilometer separation, the tracking is a little difficult. We think the promise with adaptive optics is about 135 meters separation. We can still track two satellites independently. So that's a more recent technological advancement that we made for tracking the MEV docking with Intelsat. We're going to show an insertion event. We see deployments, we see thrust events, and we see debris generation events. So let's go ahead and look at a few of those. This was an event that happened in 2018. One of the things we like to say is that what we do provides a lot of transparency to what's happening in space. This particular satellite obviously experienced some sort of onboard anomaly. The operator said that they were having an antenna pointing error, and it was proving difficult to fix. And so while that was absolutely true, what they said, clearly not the whole story. So it was, we learned a lot about this from looking at the data, and we could even identify threats to the neighboring satellites from debris that was coming off of this one. So that kind of transparency is important. You'll always get the truth from the operator, but you don't always get the full story. Next, this one happened, oh gosh, I guess it was a couple years ago now, and it was a satellite that over 3 days was experiencing many anomalies, and the consensus of the review board was that it did have some sort of event that damaged it, resulted in a fuel leak, and we definitely saw evidence of the fuel leak on day one. What they didn't know was that many pieces of debris came off of the satellite over 3 days, and several of those we still track today that are still up there in the geosynchronous region. The important thing to note here is again that the current military systems that do track objects up in space were unaware of these debris that came off of it. So it is important to have a second set of eyes. Lastly, here's another debris generating event, and the official statement from the company was they were not able to confirm if debris spotted in the vicinity of the satellite broke off of the spacecraft or originated elsewhere. I will let you look at it and decide what you think. Again, they're absolutely right in saying that, because at this time we couldn't really track things within 2 kilometers. So it would be possible to generate an event like this by having a few pieces of maneuverable debris hanging around a satellite that then bug out, so to speak. And so it's really difficult to say definitively what has happened, but we can sometimes infer what we think happened. Let's see here. All right, so on the subject of ASATs from the ground heading up to geosynchronous orbit, we're able to track everything that leaves planet Earth as long as we don't have the sun making our life difficult, and watch them on the way up to geosynchronous orbit. So when conditions are favorable, we can track everything on the way up, and which is what we did in this case. And here you're seeing satellite moving into just stopping on a dime at geo, doing some thrusting events, and it's going to deploy the satellite right now after doing a few burning events. It's important to be able to see those. They tell you kind of what stage of the insertion the satellite is in. And I'll let this go just long enough to see the payload deployment and then the fuel dump, which is going to happen, which you can see with your naked eye. This next thing I watched with my own eyes, really bright in the sky. It's also pretty. Okay, next chart. All right, lastly, we do see maybe about every year a satellite will deploy a satellite. And when that happens, we do see it. It'll appear as a new object in the catalog. And usually we will be the first to see it. And one of the things that we focused on here at EXO is being able to see very dim objects. So we can see down to about a 1U CubeSat or a 10 centimeter sized object at GEO. We're also very persistent. We watch for as much time as we can every satellite, which can be up to 20 hours a day watching a satellite. So with that level of persistence, we're usually the first people to see a deployment. And when we do have a deployment, the key is to look at the track of the new object coming off, which in this case is magenta, and then look at the image to see whether or not we do see a second object with our own eyes, and then look for indications in the photometry of some kind of change. So those are the kind of things we see. This is, here, I'll just do this real quickly. This is how we do it live in real time, is we maintain an alert status on every spacecraft up there. This is actually our live tool. I've got a satellite selected over here. And then different satellites are colored here with little halos indicating some level of interest about.
Doug, I don't think we're seeing your screen right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. It turned off. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, that was weird. Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, so this is our alerting common operating picture. And what it does show is it shows different satellites at different levels of alert status. So we're looking at anything that's in proximity with another satellite. Anything that is tumbling or drifting or tumbling and drifting is colored with a color, and we monitor this. So some examples would be DirecTV 14. They're currently undergoing a relocation. That's GOES 14. Looks like it might be spin stabilized. Inmarsat 3F2 they're drifting to a new slot. So we're watching that all the time. So at any given time, there's about 20 to 30 objects that are in some state of elevated status, and we watch those all the time. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Doug. And this is really key information, I think, particularly for UN member states, because we always talk about verification. Like, if we're going to have an agreement on space, are we going to be able to verify it, to make sure that folks are following their obligations? And your technology is going to play a key role in making sure of that.
Yeah.
So next, I'd like to jump over to Pamela real quick. So Pamela, you will be coming at this very much from the security perspective. And so I wanted to ask you, there are three parts to the UK resolution. It's looking at identification of threats, trying to describe a little bit more what are responsible forms of behavior, and what are some possible ways forward for a country like Chile. And that's a lot of countries that are emerging space actors. What does this mean for you? Where is Chile coming at this from?
Good morning. Good afternoon, Daniel. At the outset, let me thank you and Secure World Foundation for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. And also let me add, I'm honored to be sharing this virtual stage with such distinguished fellow co-panelists. Before I tackle your specific question, allow me to broadly contextualize the multilateral diplomatic environment in which the UK resolution was presented. Circumstances, as Victoria said, affect diplomacy, as you know. At this point, I believe it's safe to say, or even to reiterate, that outer space is of vital importance for modern societies and will continue to be so in the future. Space-based assets are a part of critical national and international infrastructure. Its political, economic, military, technological importance continues to increase, and at the same time, there's a growing number of actors involved. Besides the traditional spacefaring nations, there are around, I believe, 80 additional states active in outer space. And at the same time, the private sector, international consortia, are increasingly engaged in outer space activity. Space generates billions of dollars in revenue for the private sector. In practical terms, the lines between the realms of military, civil/commercial space activities is blurring, if not already erased. This collective dependence on our space-based assets has sparked concerns over the current space security regime, meaning the security of the assets. Traditionally characterized as global commons, this race to space has increased the risk of confrontation to the point where there are serious concerns of an arms race in outer space, which endangers the preservation of the space for peaceful purposes. We have negotiated a number of legal instruments that, among others, prohibit the placements of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction into orbits around the moon or on celestial bodies, prohibited the militarization of the moon. We've advanced on confidence building measures, or identified them at least, just to name a few. Nevertheless, the scope of all of these instruments is limited. For example, silence over deployment of conventional weapons in space, in outer space, for example. Over the years, it has been emphasized that they are, and I quote, far from effective in preventing an arms race in outer space. The international community has recognized this gap and called upon the Conference on Disarmament, already since its inception in 1982, to take up discussions on a treaty for the prevention of the placements of weapons in outer space within an agenda, a specific agenda item entitled Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, or PARIS. However, the CD, because of many, many reasons, has been unable to make any progress. There are long-lasting differences in threat perceptions and the appropriate measures to undertake. Do we take legal instruments or political commitments? And all of these considerations have stalled negotiations. And here's where the acronyms start. We have PPWT, TCBMs, GGEs, whatnot. In this context, the development of multilateral solutions to mitigate a potential outbreak of armed conflict in outer space has been slow, while the development and proliferation of technology, space-related technology, has continued at a fast pace. In parallel, the worsening relations among the major spacefaring nations, along with ruthless rhetoric regarding counterforce capabilities and testing of ASAT weapons, have taken center stage. It's against this backdrop, and at the outset, the UK resolution was, in our view, a positive step in reviving space security diplomacy dialogue. In the current state of affairs, as I have just described, this resolution provided for the much needed excuse to conduct multilateral dialogue on space security challenges and hopefully envisage options for revisiting the outer space legal regime. Back to the initial question that you've posed, why are the three parts of the UK resolution helpful? I would argue that it's not only the parts, but rather the entire conceptual framing of the resolution that is helpful for us. First, it allows for a novel approach to identify drivers of an arms race, focusing on behaviors, actions that exacerbate tensions and competitions, whereas traditional arms control regimes focus on objects and or capabilities. Second, we find merit in the bottoms-up approach, taking into account the existing challenges and threats and how member states understand them. And this being relevant, how do we understand threats to be? And not imposing from the start a specific format or instrument to deal with those threats and challenges. So that gives us a lot of liberty. And third, and I think that this is the most important issue for us, it acknowledges that every state, whatever its capabilities or aspirations are, has a stake in this issue, not just spacefaring nations or military space powers. Space security issues are issues of collective security and are of interest to all. This approach is much needed, taken into account that at this point, not only states, as I have just announced, are interested parties, but also non-state actors, such as commercial sector and academia. If we are to develop new rules, collective views need to be taken into account. From the perspective of developing countries, I would say, or emerging spacefaring nations, this is a sign, a welcome sign of the democratization of the multilateral dialogue on space, fostering open and inclusive processes which have been proven key in tackling other global challenges. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any question further. Thank you.
It's really disappointing that we can't actually hear the audience clapping, because that was really excellently put. And I'm glad that you're highlighting the fact that every country needs to be a part of this conversation. We're all space users. I was really struck by a statistic I heard at a conference in New Delhi, where it was pointed out that the average Indian depends on 11 satellites a day. So everyone can think a little bit about how much you depend on a satellite, or how much you depend on satellites in your own country. And it's everyone. It's ubiquitous. It's around the world. And you also lead into another aspect, which is the commercial sector. So I'd like to pop over to David real quick, because the companies like Eutelsat and SES and SpaceX are not typically part of the security conversation. Usually we're talking about militaries, we're talking about governments doing things, but the commercial sector has become, I mean, even a larger part of the space environment than militaries and governments. And so, David, from your perspective, where you're sitting at Eutelsat, what are Eutelsat's concerns regarding space security, and what do you see as being some of the necessary discussions that need to be had amongst the space community?
Hello, Daniel, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for actually including me and through me, Eutelsat and the private sector in the conversation as you did. At least the Secure World Foundation is doing that job, and it is true that with a fleet of 37 satellites serving more than 1 billion end users in about 150 countries, Eutelsat is one of the first space operators with global activities, and so we believe we have a major interest in this security-related conversation, because, of course, a secure space, to put it bluntly, is also the key to securing our profits, which is always a major driver. One of the first points I'd like to make, although I know I'm addressing a crowd of largely of specialists, but is that space infrastructure should increasingly be viewed as a system, especially for telecoms, but I believe not just. It's pretty much the same for navigation or imagery, I guess. But so what does that mean? Well, it means that there isn't really any separate treatment of the different orbits. It means that there isn't a single perception of the Earth-space relation. And it means also that, the future of space will be very much about a combination of different orbits linked together, communicating with increasingly sophisticated terrestrial infrastructure, gateways, data centers, etc., the resilience and protection of which will be equally important. So please do realize that for a space operator, safety and security of space operations do not just happen in outer space. they actually start on the ground, and they continue all the way up to the birds up there. So you asked me to give views about the perceived threats. Well, perhaps to start with, and again at the risk of disappointing some who are looking at the fancy kits and the ASATs and the futuristic weapons, I'd like to recall that since the very beginning of the telecommunications age and the start of space-based services, interference has been the nightmare of all the operators. And the operators have done a lot to limit, reduce, or even escape them. And from a regulatory standpoint, of course, a lot of work is done within the framework of the ITU. The hostile interference remains a prime and pretty cheap way to disable or disrupt satellite operations from Earth. So worth recalling. Cybersecurity is also a must. A satellite operator is potentially just as vulnerable as any other company to a cyber attack. Actually, this is not quite true, because obviously we take extra precautions, in particular to maintain our ability to constantly control our satellites in all circumstances. But there are many information flows to a satellite. There's the C2, there's content, of course, in the case of telecommunications. And there are, alongside those networks, there are just the corporate networks. So the bottom line, again, is it's not necessarily worth shooting a missile in outer space when you can disable a ground station or just wreak havoc in the HQ of an operator. On-orbit maneuvers are a source of increasing concern as well, especially, of course, when they are performed by objects with unclear intentions or that are unregistered. And rendezvous technologies certainly have very positive applications if you think of cleaning the lower orbit, for instance. But how do you know that one spacecraft that approaches another is doing that peacefully? How can you be sure? And another interesting item perhaps to take into account is laser. Laser links between satellites at the same orbits or at different orbits seem to attract an increasing level of attention and interest as a way to, of course, transport data. But powerful lasers could have different kind of uses, of course. And therefore, it is important also that it doesn't become a new source of interference or disruption of activities. And of course, I would say at the sort of high end of the spectrum, there's everything that can cause debris. So all the activities that cause debris, including, of course, destructive or kinetic action, which is certainly not a responsible behavior. But as you can see, I would place this quite high in the sort of spectrum. So very briefly, what can we do about it, and what would be our expectations as a private actor? Well, first of all, having a picture of all of this is key, and certainly space situational awareness or space traffic management is not yet really at a level commensurate with the challenges. Of course, there are some now great, private sector resources, not just US military resources, but there's a lot of improvements there that can still be made for operators, all operators, to have a clear picture. National norms, rules, or even simple principles of good behavior. I belong to an operator based in France. France has a very stringent space law, but this is far from being the case in all spacefaring nations. So that's very, very important. I mentioned risky maneuvers. especially proximity maneuvers. It would make sense to have a place where we can discuss those, be warned in advance, exchange information about this, especially in LEO, in lower orbits. Similarly, a sort of commercial or civilian agreed concept of how to make use of lasers in space could be of importance, again, to create confidence, because the key at the end of the day, and I'll stop there, is really to protect space access to all countries, of course. We just spoke about those aspiring nations, but also new private actors, and you know, the freedom of access to space has to be protected, and of course preventing the weaponization of space is equally very important. I know that some, at least in some corners, have this idea that the private sector is very excited about new capabilities and warfaring capabilities because you know, this is more expensive kit to manufacture and send in outer space. Well, from the point of view of an operator, this is more of a danger than anything else, and this is not the kind of kit that we want to put in orbit.
Thank you, David. That's what we want to hear, and I think we all have the very similar hopes that you know, that industry, you know, probably sees things very in very similar light, and will also continue to be a part of this conversation and to provide additional impetus and building momentum towards eventually coming up with some kind of a framework that will ensure access to space. And so let me bring the conversation back to Victoria real quick. Victoria, David actually just gave some great examples of various areas that seem to be lacking in terms of rules or principles. So he talked about close proximity operations. He talked about destructive anti-satellite weapons. You know, at the moment, what do you see as being some areas where states might actually be able to have some convergence, where they have some common interests and maybe some possible activities that could be the subject of discussions for some type of arms control framework?
Sure. I mean, to start off, I don't think it's helpful to say, okay, our end goal is going to be a treaty straight off. I mean, the last treaty was from, you know, 40 plus years ago. The way that we handle things has really changed. Having said that, there's a whole spectrum of responses that can be done when we're looking at, okay, how do we determine what is responsible behavior? How do we determine good intent? How do we share information about capabilities? And so things like having a discussion about saying, okay, we're not going to have debris creating ASAT tests, just in general. That's something that you decide not to do. That would be a positive step, because A, no one likes debris, as David just said. It affects all users, whether or not you're the one that created it. It also demonstrates that there are expectations, you know, guardrails on behavior, and that you have a responsibility to other users of space to not necessarily limit your behavior, but recognize your actions affect others. And so I think that would be a really positive step in that direction as well. And it could be built on eventually to lead to some sort of legal framework. But I really feel like the norm needs to be established first, and you can go up from there. And then the other thing that I find very encouraging is there are a lot of discussions by the commercial sector about what sort of responsible behavior they want to see. Talking about rendezvous and service proximity operations, there's CONFIRS, the Consortium for Execution Rendezvous and Servicing Operations. Secure World is sort of affiliated with that, but that's the idea. You get the commercial sector involved in developing what sort of guidelines and principles for on-orbit servicing you want to see, so you can identify behavior that's in the norm. That way you can call out when it's not. I mean, that's a really great way of doing it. You have the Space Safety Coalition, which is a living document by satellite operators talking about what do they see as responsible behavior. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about approaching it. There's not going to be any one particular approach. It's not going to be just, okay, we had one discussion at the CD and hey, we fix it, space is secure. Space is complicated. And so the approach to fix it, to stabilize it, will be complicated as well. But I think all stakeholders have a role to play to this. And it's really helpful to have a strong, bolstered foundation to get them all involved in the conversation, as Pamela said. Thank you.
Pamela, would you like to follow up on that? Any comments?
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, what we are expecting from this resolution is, at the minimum, we would end up with a better collective understanding of current threats to space security and their implications for all of us, motivations, aspirations as well. And as Victoria has just stated, we can also be able to outline a common ground for the international community in advancing shared objectives for sustaining a secure environment in outer space. And I would like to quote Ambassador Little, the UK ambassador to the CD, for those who don't know him. Their expectations on what this resolution will do are really humble. It's to start a discussion. And I think that that is really needed. So we believe that it's one step. It's the first step, but we believe that it's also in the right direction. Back to you, Daniel.
Thanks. Doug, I noticed also that a lot of the things that Victoria was just talking about related more to behaviors rather than types of technology. So, a lot of the conversations that we've had in the past have always been about, trying to limit certain types of technology that might get deployed in space. In terms of, what you can see, what would be easier for us to deal with from a visual perspective, or what we're monitoring? Can we tell what a satellite is or what it can do, or do you have to wait until it does it to know?
Yeah, so so in my opening slides, you should have been able to see what our capabilities were, but that may not have completely translated to what can we tell about a spacecraft. So I would say, think of us as like a news organization that knows who, what, when, where. We don't know why. So when we track the satellites, we know whose it is. And sometimes it can take a while to disentangle it. And we'll generally know what its capabilities are from a maneuvering sense, what we've learned on the ground, but there's always a little bit of unknown. We know where it is, when it is. So we know those things. Establishing intent is difficult, but one of the things that, before we would even talk about those kind of advanced things, and I think we know pretty much what things are doing up there, is the role of this body would be to come up with some resolution that would change behaviors, right? Make space safer. And number one, you have to agree on what are the behaviors that you don't like. And the simplest one that we know how to measure is, how close did two spacecraft get? And do they have to have a license to get close? And so you have to have an agreement that there's some minimum distance. Then you have to be able to monitor it. I think we do a good job monitoring it, but then everyone has to agree. We might not agree with another country how close two spacecraft got, right? And that can be very difficult. And then you have to be able to enforce it. Well, what is the enforcement? Maybe that's not the role of this body. But I would say we know how to do all those up to the enforcement part. And right now, there's this 10-kilometer guideline rule that everyone seems to stick to. Even something as simple as that, I see being challenging to get through a body like this. And that would be maybe the first place even to start. But I believe we know how to do it. And the hard part would be getting people to agree that when you say it's 10 kilometers, or when you say that I got within 10 kilometers, I disagree. That might be the sticking point. In addition to, if I want to do things that require me to get within 10 kilometers, then I don't want to give it up.
Yeah.
But that would be the simplest one.
Yeah, and
If
that's.
I could just, I'm
No,
sorry,
go ahead,
Daniel,
Victoria.
if I just
No,
follow
please
up.
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to emphasize something Doug said about it's difficult to verify behavior. One of the things that happens a lot with these arms control discussions is we look at capabilities and we assume, okay, we can modify things from there. But really, it is very hard to verify capabilities. What you're doing is you're seeing objects, as Doug said, and then you have to kind of guess at that point what they're trying to do. And that's where sharing information and improving transparency about space policies, about missions, budgets, if it's possible. You just kind of giving a signal as to what your intent is. That's one way to get some of this guesswork out of the way. But the other way that I think is super helpful, until we get to that point of open access and shared information all the way around, we may never get to that point of complete transparency, is the idea of using these SSA capabilities to verify actions. and to verify behavior. And that's, I think, something that can give you a starting point for conversations about what do we see as being the norm, what do we see as being responsible, what do we see as being irresponsible. You know, as Pamela said, one of the key things that we're all hoping comes out of this responses resolution is that right now, if you talk to delegates in the CD, there's not a shared common understanding as to what the threat is for space security. And you can't fix a problem if you don't agree as to what the problem actually is. And so if we can start off at this point and say, okay, generally speaking, we identify these threats to not just be to satellites, but to the ground system, to the user segments. It's not just threats from space, but threats to space and everything in between. Then that helps us start off with a more positive view in terms of how we're going to accomplish, you know, getting out of the gridlock that we've seen so far in multilateral forum. Thank you.
And I think you strike there on another important note about all this, just trying to agree on where to start. What is the problem? Where do we go? David, I wonder if I could bounce back to you real quick. One of the conversations that we often have in this field is how to get the commercial sector involved. And given that the commercial sector is doing most of the activities, how do you see the commercial sector providing input in terms of how to establish norms? Like, what do you see are the best avenues available to you at the moment for engaging with, you know, the United Nations? Is it going through your host countries? So like maybe Eutelsat goes through France or through someone else? Is it, you know, how do we get the commercial sector more involved in these types of conversations?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That's indeed a very good point, because again, I think that space operators have a lot to bring to the conversation, because they have an experience of, you know, what they see, what they can witness in outer space. My sort of, you know, first answer, based also on our practice, is at least for you know the biggest operators is to convey views to the national authorities. I mean, typically in the case of Eutelsat, subject to the French space law, subject to a number of licensing requirements, we have a sort of continuous dialogue with France's CNES and the responsible ministry. So we have quite a number of ways to make our views known. Doesn't mean that those views become France's views. They are one element among many others. And actually, perhaps also, and there I take it upon myself as a task, but especially for global operators, we should probably be speaking more globally and not just to our sort of national authority, because also, you know, for a global operator, in a case of, let's say, in a case of conflict, it can become a very challenging situation. Of course, I mean, we want to stay perfectly politically neutral, but given that we have operations in many countries, you know, who are we supposed to talk to in case of conflict? Would we not receive contradictory messages or even requests from various parties to that conflict? Sorry, so we have to pay attention to that as well. So national authorities, and probably not just those of our flag, and then of course, I mean, any sort of open you know, open framework, I mean, UN type, but open to non-state actors is also very useful. And now you increasingly, I mean, if I take the example of the cyber domain, there are ways in which the private sector can make its views known. I mean, you know, private players, companies can speak to a GGE, to an OEWG. They can be invited to that. So I think that, you know, really at the end of the day, if you want to have the views of the private sector, you can find ways. But more fundamentally, and you know, I have myself this question, being a former diplomat, is, you know, in the event the international community would want to draft another treaty, or even a protocol, let's say, to the Outer Space Treaty, could it still be done like in the 60s or 70s, when really it was, inconceivable that, private players would have access to space? Now the perspective is almost the opposite. So should there be an even bigger room for those players? That's a question worth considering, and perhaps we should look at experiences like in climate related negotiation, where big room now is made in the multilateral process for private players.
Yeah, and I also want to flag something that my colleague Raji from Observer Research Foundation pointed out recently too, that we have to be careful also when we introduce industry, because a lot of times other countries will mistake industry perspectives for just being like a sort of Western perspective. And what we want to show, I think, or what is important to demonstrate, is that space companies are doing work all over the world and providing data for many people. And so it's important to have them be a part of the conversation and providing their views. So I've got some really interesting questions that are coming in from the audience now, and I think I'd like to go ahead and start diving into some of those. Victoria, Pamela, the first one is very much geared towards y'all, and that is, do you see naming and shaming? So many times when we're talking about legally binding instruments versus voluntary instruments or political instruments, for political instruments, the main tool for enforcement of the obligations there is naming and shaming. Somebody steps out of line or does an action that does not conform with norms of responsible behavior, and you call them out. The first question is, will this type of strategy actually work on major countries, so countries like China or the US or Russia? And do we have any instances where this has even shown to be effective? Who wants to take a first crack at that? Victoria?
I can. Yeah, I mean, the whole ITU is based on this very theory, name and shame. That they're deliberately built to be toothless. They're meant to just call out bad behavior. You take it from there. But specifically in terms of, maybe counter space capabilities, I would point to the 2007 China anti-satellite test. It was the third one they had tried. It's the first one they successfully intercepted, and there was a huge outcry about the amount of debris that was created, to the point where, I think the Chinese delegate, the foreign ministry was kind of caught offside in terms of how much stress and, Sturm und Drang would create the international system. And so I think you see what happens is a few years later, China has another test, same interceptor, same type of target. They called it a missile defense that time. Everyone's called missile defense test. They didn't want to bring on that level of notoriety and consternation, being perceived as a bad actor. China in particular is very interested in presenting itself as an alternative to the United States in the international system, that it's a global power that brings other space actors with it. That is how they're trying to sell themselves. And so I think people tend to underestimate the power of perception for these international things. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's truly what international relations come down to, is how you're perceived, because countries are going to do what they're going to do. But if they want to be perceived as being good actors, then I think it can be helpful. And the last thing I'll say before I stop on this, North Korea, which is not typically perceived as being perhaps the most cooperative country in international discussions, when they have their launches, they do things you're supposed to do. They do a notice to mariners. They do a notice to airmen. They go through the processes that are set up to be able to do this in a safe and in a stable manner. So I think there is a lot of power to be said for this. It's not bulletproof, but I think there's more strength than people give it credit for. Thank you.
Pamela, what do you think?
Okay, I will present the perspective from the diplomatic angle, and I completely agree with Victoria from the civil society, academia angle. But as a diplomat, I would say it's not a good idea, the naming and shaming strategy, because what we need to do is promote a collaborative international environment when you're in the room negotiating. And this is not idealism. It's really being pragmatic. If we don't try to engage all the actors, and especially the spacefaring ones, we will not achieve a more secure outer space. That's from my experience. Thank you.
If I
No,
could
but
do a quick
that's-
follow-up on that, I agree, Pamela. I was working on the assumption that there had been something like this resolution where you have an established list or guidance of principles or something where you have responsible behavior identified, and then you could identify when people step away from that path. That's kind of what I was thinking. I yield to your knowledge about diplomatic discussions as well.
David, I would look to you as well. In your experience, both as a former diplomat and also in industry, do you see naming and shaming as being a useful tool?
Well,
And how should we use it?
Yeah, there have been instances in the past when we made quite publicly known some of the troubles we were encountering with some countries, and probably those who are a little bit of experts understand what I'm alluding to, in particular when it was referring to interferences. It can be a bit tricky, of course, depending on the type of relation you have, as a private actor with the country that, if it's country, which is the origin of the problem you're encountering. But what is for sure is that the sort of sometimes very diplomatic, below the radar way of dealing with things at the ITU is not always extremely effective. So naming and shaming could be another avenue. There are more subtle ways to do this. I mean, if you witness some behaviors in space, maybe you can go through also your national authorities, and they can relay that to the country that, for instance, is sending strange objects sniffing around your own satellites. That's another possibility. But what I would add is that at any rate, if you name and shame, it at some point it also has to come with responsibility or liability. And so, without opening another entire debate for another seminar, but it certainly begs the question of where the international liability in space is. It's another undersubscribed convention, and we may want to address that problem as well.
I've sent a link around to everyone in case they weren't totally sure what David was referring to. So moving along, I've got some interesting questions here from some old friends, and I'll just go ahead and read them out. There is one from Helmut Lagos. So Pamela, I imagine you will also have to answer here. Helmut used to be in the CD, and he was first secretary as well for in disarmament, and he represented Chile in a number of space-related initiatives in the UN. So he says, considering the difficulties to agree on a new treaty, would it not be a good time maybe to convene a meeting of states parties to the Outer Space Treaty, which could maybe be an opportunity to review and, if necessary, add an additional protocol to update and address the current threats to space security? So the old question about opening up the space treaty or finding an addendum, what do you think?
Should I start?
If you'd like to add to that, but Victoria and David, I think that might be going to the two of you.
Pamela can take first crack.
Thank you, Victoria. Just also to flag, Helmut Lagos is not only a dear colleague, he has been my mentor, and everything I know I've learned from him. So gladly. We are of the view that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty remains the basis of international space legal regime. Nevertheless, due to the remarkable achievements in the field of space technologies and the activities, this regulatory regime has lagged behind. I think that doesn't come as a surprise. It fails to address arms control in outer space adequately. And there are a number of legal issues related with outer space which ought to be addressed and regulated, as David has also pointed out. And at the same time, military confrontations are now within the realm of the possible. So taking into account that further militarization of outer space will lead or has already led to an arms race. And we can't get those discussions in the current state of stalemate within the CD and other security related forums. And there are discussions that we need to have. So yes, I would be of the view that having the first meeting of states parties to the Outer Space Treaty would be an advancement, and as the NPT is the cornerstone of the nuclear regime, non-proliferation regime, the Outer Space Treaty is the cornerstone for us because of the principles it lays out. After the first meeting of states parties, you could also have a review conference, which is what is sorely needed. Thank you.
Victoria?
Yeah, I think it's a really bad idea, with all due respect. I think what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to just a dissolution of the treaty. We have not seen successful discussions in multilateral fora on space security issues when you're focusing on a treaty aspect. I think it would just end up being, the same issues we've seen when we talk about Paros or, anything like that, PBWT. I think it's just going to be the same discussion where everyone's going to try and get their own particular hobby horse put into the discussion without actually fixing any of the problems. Again, it comes down to the basic thing. What do we see as the common threat? What do we see as a way to go about to fix it? What are the ways forward? What do we see as responsible behavior? Those are all discussions that need to be had. They do not need to be done as an additional protocol to the treaty. They can be done now. And I would also identify that, the way that counter space capabilities are proliferating, I don't think we can afford to wait the decades that it would possibly take. I would point to the long-term sustainability guidelines for the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, which is fantastic. I wholeheartedly support it. Full bias. My current boss was a working group chair for that. But it took almost a decade to come up with these 21 guidelines, and those specifically focus on spaceflight safety. They do not include third rail topics such as security. And that's a feature of the UN system. It's not a bug. But having recognized that we're in a circumstance now where the space domain is changing now, counter space capabilities are proliferating now, and we have the opportunity to try and get ourselves on a new path moving forward to identify ways in which to help really stabilize and make the space environment more predictable and secure for all. And I think going back to the previous arms control mechanisms that have not yielded for decades now would not be a good way to do that. Thank you.
David, you're looking very pensive. What do you think?
No, I was listening carefully to Victoria. I find myself a little bit between Victoria and Pamela in the sense that, of course, in particular as a former diplomat, I cannot argue that it's a bad thing for countries to gather, talk, and try to reach a result. At the same time, I do acknowledge what Victoria said. It seems to me that we are still very far from a sort of global consensus on the issue, and so it might be dangerous to starting to unravel a treaty that is among the, let's face it, very totemic treaties that are still standing. At the end of the day, taking the point of view of an operator, I would say that right now, and given the pace also of technological developments, what we would really need is sound and real implementation of some of the norms or guidelines that already exist. The long-term sustainability guidelines are probably not a panacea, and they're not entirely geared towards security benefits in the hard sense of the word. But if already these could be properly implemented, translated into national legislation where it has to, and with this translation actively monitored, and there could be some naming and shaming made about the countries that subscribe to these but are not implementing that. For us as private sector players, this would be wonderful. I mean, first of all, to ensure the safety of a spacecraft, but also in terms of level playing field and competition with actors that are not bound by those guidelines. So to me, this is really equally important.
Pamela, you look like you want to say something.
Thank you, Daniel. And I can't contradict Victoria and also taken into account David's remarks now. We can all agree that the political and diplomatic negotiations are very difficult. That's true. But this is, and here I'm wearing my diplomat hat, the beauty of diplomacy. If this same fatalistic approach was assumed in other processes, just to mention the Paris Agreement and the TPNW, for instance, the results would have been quite different. So I wouldn't strike it out completely, acknowledging that it is very challenging. Nevertheless, it's a different situation. It's much more complex, but perhaps the issue of having more actors involved also would create a different result. Thank you.
True. Thank you, Pamela. Doug, let's bring you back into the conversation. I have a question here that I'm going to flip on its head a little bit. In a perfect universe, I'm sure that the United Nations would suddenly have this, amazing budget, and they could hire you to monitor space at all times and give you billions and billions of dollars for a whole new set of telescopes and computers. But absent that, what do you see as being like a good arrangement or framework or setup so that countries can have access to the information that you're collecting, and that they can be able to utilize it for whatever detective work they need to do for activities in space? What do you see as being like the ideal setup, apart from you getting a $5 billion contract from the UN, which I'm sorry, we just don't have it.
Yeah, the simple answer, of course, is they certainly could hire us. There are a number of, now this is definitely the way that the world is going. The world is going towards a more collaborative space situational awareness capability. And I'll call it a system like David did. If it's really going to have meaning, it's got to be a system. So there have been a number of larger efforts. For example, the Europe SST program, the Space Surveillance Program. And then you've got the United States Department of Commerce, who was tasked with developing a similar system for the US. It's not, it's not clear where those are going to go, but it's one thing that is very clear is that each nation is looking to have its own sovereign capability, which I think is the best first step. And that really does mean having your ability to collect data and understand data at first. And then when we get to where we can share, and there are technical challenges to sharing, and there are trust values, there are trust issues for sharing, only then, if you have that technical expertise you developed in your own country, will you be able to take in other people's data and get value out of it. And I think that there are some enormous steps that need to be taken first. Now, with that being said, I am absolutely wholeheartedly in favor of the United Nations establishing, I think it was a space situational awareness system open to all states. I would just say that'd be great. Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to develop the trust between the nation states? And then the technical hurdles are going to be monumental. And so who's going to do that?
Anybody else like to take a crack at that? I'm sure you have some thoughts.
I think it's, if I may, I think it's beneficial to have more SSA capabilities being spread out because I think it does give you a richer picture. But I think what we're going to come into at some point is there's going to be, and Doug alluded to this earlier, a disagreement in terms of whether, let's say, for example, a conjunction is going to happen. That happened actually last fall, where one company said, okay, this satellite's going to be hit by a piece of debris, and another company said, no, we don't see that. And so how do you make a decision? And that's really where you need to lay the groundwork for this trust. We can verify through outside sources, what sort of information are you getting? And that's part of a larger conversation that requires, an international collaborative approach to the shared domain. Having said that as well, though, I think there's a minimum level of spaceflight safety data that should be shared and be available, just because space is a public domain. And I want to make sure it's not limited, SSA data is only limited to those who can afford to pay for it. I think it's definitely right now, it's shared internationally, largely by the US military. And that's great. Again, it's public spaceflight safety. I'd like to encourage at least a minimum level of SSA data being shared because of that. Because as Doug also said, the capacity at, for some owner operators, they don't have the ability to do their own analysis. They just take what the US says and go with it. So we need to see, I think, capacity building as well. Thank you.
Anyone else like to add something? Sure, David.
Yeah. Just, briefly, the truth is that today commercial operators are extremely dependent on one source of information. The US military. Of course, with the addition of the information exchange between ourselves, through the Space Data Association, for instance. So certainly having something that is more of a public service is important. Also, I guess, and they are more with a sort of a national hat. Also something that would not be at risk in the worst of cases, in a conflict case, being able to rely on a tool that would not be unplugged or disconnected because precisely there's a conflict. So it's also, I guess, a sovereignty issue, at least for the most active countries in space. You can't depend entirely on something that could be switched off or reserved to only a certain circle of countries. But my last point is that while, of course, it is very nice and it's an enormous progress to have more SSA, you also have to gradually move to STM and to manage this. And to me, the awareness, the sort of picture, is only one aspect. Once you have the picture, and as Victoria also was alluding to, you have to manage the potentially dangerous situations. And so how do you talk to if it's talking to another operator, we kind of manage today, although of course there are new actors and not all of them are equally used to having this dialogue, like the GEO operators on their GEO orbits. LEO is more challenging. But let's say, for instance, you have a problem either with a state-owned object or with an unregistered object. You don't know what it is. How are you supposed to have this conversation about deconflicting, preventing a hazardous event and all of this? So again, having the tool is fantastic, but there's another part of the conversation that also has to follow.
Yeah, no, I agree. So first we need to be able to see it, and then we need to be able to manage it. I feel like Mariba is channeling himself into our discussion. Pamela, there is a question here for you. It's from Paul Meyer, retired ambassador former Canadian ambassador to the CD. He says, the existing UN General Assembly Paros resolution also recognizes all states as stakeholders in preserving space security, solicits their views, and speaks to the need for further measures to prevent an arms race. Does the UK resolution really add value, or does it risk diluting the near unanimous support of the Paros resolution? What do you think? It's a tough one.
It is. It's a tough one, and coming from Paul Meyer, the Paul Meyer, it's no big pressure, right? I will be quite honest. I believe it does not contradict, but it complements the Paris resolution, as it engages all stakeholders in issues that have been traditionally concern for spacefaring nations, mainly. At this stage, we have a bigger developing or emerging spacefaring countries' sense of awareness of preserving security of all types of outer space activities beyond the defense and weaponization issues. Having a resolution annually approved every year is good, but it's just not enough. We need to update and make progress in this regard, and we need a discussion we need to start a discussion. And Paris has its political complexities, as Ambassador Meyer knows. Thank you.
I know he does. Victoria, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the name inherently, PAROS, Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space, it has a very specific view as to what the security threat is. That is to say, weapons in space. And it has a very specific perspective that it's hardware and technology that is the threat. And frankly, I don't think that is an accurate representation as to what is destabilizing space to this day. I think you need to have a broader conception of threats to space from the ground, threats to space systems on the ground, threat to space users, threat to ground stations, but as well looking at activities on orbit. I don't think PAROS really captures that nuance in terms of what is actually destabilizing. It doesn't talk about that at all. So I think the things like the UK resolution are really helpful because they broaden the discussion to incorporate space security and stability the way it actually is, not the way it was perceived decades ago. Thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and double up on you, as Paul also had a question that I think was probably aimed at you as well. But and I'll expand on this a little bit. Will the Biden administration continue to characterize outer space as a warfighting domain in which the U.S. military is to pursue the goal of dominance? And I'll add on to that by asking Victoria, in your in your expertise, do you see the United States maybe being more open to space arms control, or at least to being more constructive in what has traditionally been a field where the United States kind of takes a backseat and is not terribly proactive?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Very good question. I mean, I think the idea of space being a warfighting domain, that dates back at least openly being spoken about to 2014, so during the Obama administration. So it is not something that was just the Trump administration. Now that Biden's in, they can just chuck it. I think it's part of a larger approach to space being a key national security enabler for the United States. Speaking as an observer, not as obviously a spokesperson for the U.S. government, but this is something, a common discussion that's been held in national security circles for decades now. How do you ensure that this military space capability is going to be there? And the idea of using space as a warfighting domain, it allows for things like Space Command and Space Force to be able to use. Space Force organizes, trains, and equips forces that are then used by Space Command. Now, has there been unhelpful rhetoric? Absolutely. And I think maybe that was done, by people who had an agenda that wanted to push for a more aggressive U.S. posture for counter space capabilities. And there are those that are, it's almost a fight for the soul of this U.S. Space Force. Will it be primarily focused on establishing, continued access to space and, identifying threats and making sure that space is usable for the U.S. military for the long term? Or is it going to go farther? And I think we're at a point where that's definitely discussions being had. But I think generally speaking, space is a warfighting domain. That's part of a common approach that reflects more U.S. military space for decades now. In regards to your question, Daniel, about U.S. and space arms control, the U.S. national space policy has almost always been very pro space arms control, as long as it's effective, verifiable, and in the security interest of the United States and its allies. The Trump national space policy, which came out minutes before they left office, said that as well. So I think that is a common interest for the United States. So I think definitely we would be approaching it. Having said that, this administration does seem more interested in having a global approach to these shared issues. I would point out the U.S. Has said under the Biden administration that they will continue to support the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords are basically outer space treaty principles that were picked up and brought out to how continued use of exploration of the moon and looking at space resource use eventually. The idea that there are responsible behaviors to ensure that it's still usable for all, and then kind of signing on from there. So I think there's definite interest, and I think there is absolutely room now for discussions about whether it's not space arms control, or as I said earlier, guardrails on behavior, identifying responsible behavior. And part of that is because the U.S. military is the one driving some of the discussions within the U.S. government. The U.S. military recognizes it's to its benefit to ensure that there are responsible actions in space just because it's going to, you know, suffer the consequences if there's a rogue player doing things that are irresponsible. And so I think with that, that gives more cover to the larger U.S. government discussions about whether there's space arms control or any kind of, you know, identifying responsible actions in space. Thank you.
So we're coming up on about 5 minutes left. I'm going to let everybody give a last comments before we close up. But I would also like to draw to the attention of, or to bring everyone's attention to recent comments that were made by General Burt, who's a large, I think second in command at U.S. Space Force. And I'm not going to focus so much on her comments regarding the binding element of the UK resolution, but she did say that one of the things that she would like to look at is defining what is hostile behavior. So maybe coming to some type of agreement around some of the terms that we don't know how to apply to outer space yet. Things like use of force in outer space, or self-defense in outer space, or even just trying to define what is a norm of behavior. How are people supposed to act? And I wonder if that's not something that, or a conversation that might be had due to this resolution that has gone forward. So I'd like to invite everyone to just kind of give some final remarks, and if you have anything to add on, whether or not it would be useful to get some new definitions going, or some clarity on how to apply some of the laws that we have, I'll welcome your remarks. Pamela, you want to start?
Yes, Daniel. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a really relevant one in terms of definitions. For instance, we have these two neatly committees in the UN, the first committee and the fourth committee. We have them siloed in what belongs to COPUOS in Vienna, what belongs to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, or the Disarmament Commission in New York. Sometimes we see that there are issues in the outer space discussion that are cross-cutting. The UK resolution, what it does is invites states, parties, member states to actually inform, give their views on what are threats specifically, but also risks and hazards in terms of trying to understand and trying to make the discussion broader. We know that risks and hazards are dealt with in COPUOS, and we know that threats are specifically security-related issues, but not every country sees that. And as I've said before, not every issue is neatly cut. It's not cookie cutter in one or the other. So I would say that it will help us, and in the long term, I would hope to see more coordination and communication between this first committee, fourth committee, or these two approaches. And as final, I have the floor. I would like to also add that this new approach, this discussion that has been started, we hope that it will allow us to move forward, but it should not be understood. And this is as an emerging spacefaring nation, and also as a member of this developing world, it should not be understood as a substitution or a resignation of our more ambitious goals of a legally binding instrument on preventing an arms race in outer space, but as a synergic process that contributes broadly to space security. As expressed in the conclusions of the GGE on TCBMs in 2013, voluntary political measures can form the basis for consideration of concepts and proposals for legally binding obligations. What would make this UK resolution successful, or make this a productive dialogue, I would say any recommendation or way forward which might be envisaged should be consistent with the interests of all member states, and from our perspective, take into account those of developing countries, which is namely in the principle of space, outer space, as a common interest of all mankind in progress of the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Brilliantly put. That's a tough act to follow, but Doug, care to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to fold in some of the other questions. One of the questions was regarding the spaces of warfighting domain. And, a couple of the larger reasons why the U.S. Space Force was started is that the United States has the most to lose if there's any conflict in space. And I think that is something to keep in mind. And that's both militarily and economically. So militarily, we know that U.S. is dependent on space, but our economy is the most dependent on space, maybe of any in the world. And so any type of kinetic actions in space are going to be things that the United States doesn't want at all. And so getting back to David's comment of RF interference being the largest problem with the commercial operators, that's also the easiest to implement non-kinetic effect in space right now. And so when talking about how are we going to quantify what are threats in space, I like to go back to it was a personal moment for me sitting with Kay Sears, and she was the head of Intelsat General in the day, and they had a Russian satellite parked next to them, and we had noticed it a while ago, and Analytical Graphics had alerted them to the fact, and we were working with them at the time, and so I was sitting there with her, and we were showing her the live feed of her satellite and the Russian satellite, and she looked at me and she said, "What do you think they're doing?" And I said, "Well, are they interfering with you?" She goes, "No." I go, "Well, I mean, we would just be guessing, right, at what they're doing. But I said, are they doing anything wrong?" Which she said, "Well, there's no rules against what they're doing." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" She said, "Well, we sent a letter to the embassy." And even in that simple case, we couldn't, our discussion, come up with anything that was wrong with what was happening because they were 70 kilometers away, maybe technically right on the edge of a slot, in the slot a little bit. But it was very difficult for us to even agree that they were doing anything wrong, but she knew she didn't like it. And so those kind of discussions are going to be very difficult, especially, right now there's sort of a rule of thumb that 10 kilometers is the limit, and we know how to measure that. Is there anything wrong with being within 10 kilometers? Because when I'm here on Earth, 10 kilometers is far. That's the next town over. So I think these are going to be difficult conversations, but I wholeheartedly think we need to tackle them, and this is probably the body to do it.
Thanks, Doug. And also, I would like to point out from just the feedback we've been receiving, you win the award for best background, and your dog is also really adorable.
Thanks. Is it the dog or is it?
It's the book. It's the bookshelves. Everybody wants your bookshelves.
Yeah, the one thing I've carried with me everywhere.
Excellent, David. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I point out that we're really aware of the new challenges and threats, and as a commercial actor, unfortunately, we have to take these into account as best as we can. We will not revert the trend by ourselves of space being a military operational domain. But we should not be mistaken, as I said in the beginning, with a wrong debate or fixated with only one aspect, which is weapons in outer space. There are other threats out there. And certainly, again, in the sort of best effort approach that I outlined, certainly when it comes to some of these other threats, in particular cyber, there are things that we can do, and we are doing them to protect ourselves. My second remark would be to say that regarding all the already existing rules of good behavior, the key word is implementation. Again, for us, implementation is the one important thing, both for the safety of objects in orbit, but also for having a level playing field among players. And finally, I would point to one challenge or dilemma which we haven't talked a lot about, but I mean, you did mention this, Daniel, I think in your introduction, or was it Victoria perhaps? But that's, of course, we continuously wonder about the implications of the increasingly dual nature of the business of commercial operators, because whether it's imagery, telecoms, or navigation, we all support military actors, whether in peacetime or during operations, because there are not enough purely military sovereign satellites to do the business expected. And so how our assets would be viewed in a real time of conflict is a question mark. You would think that the obvious targets would be the clearly national military satellites, but what if commercial satellites are targeted as well, and how should we react in that context is also something we have to perhaps devote a bit of attention to.
I'll take the opportunity to plug a paper by one of my mentors, Dr. David Koplow over at Georgetown University, was just writing about how we might start seeing some issues, international humanitarian legal issues, with the mixing of military and civilian services on a single satellite. So if anybody wants to check that out, I highly recommend you read anything by Professor Koplow. Victoria, would you like to close us out?
I will, and I recognize we're over time, so I shall try to be succinct. But regards to your question about norms, I'd like to point out Project Plowshares in Canada, with Jessica West and Gilles Doucet, have done an excellent survey of what norms are for space and identifying gaps and contradictions. I think it'd be helpful for people to read that and get an understanding of where we are. But the point I would like to make about norms is that they can be good and they can be bad. And so if we don't take an active role in identifying which behaviors you want to see and which behaviors you don't want to see, I think we can drift into a place where perhaps the norms that are established are not the norms that we want to be established. And that's, again, where I think things like the discussion raised by this UK resolution can be so helpful, because it can identify the norms that we want to see, be the change that you want to be in the world. It can identify that and hopefully move on so that space will be sustainable and stable for all over the long term. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody. Well, I think that's pretty much it for today. We've gone over time, but it looks like just about everyone, a lot of folks still stuck around. Thank you very much to our panelists, David, Pamela, Doug, Victoria. As always, it's been a pleasure. Big special shout out to Jan for helping us with all of the production, and of course to our team who's helping us with closed captioning as well. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. Secure World Foundation, you can find us at swfound.org. Always around to help.